Okay, so the next definitions you need to know before we get into common sentence mistakes are phrases and clauses. These are very simple. Phrase is any group of words at all. You'll see underneath my examples that red teapot, rolling away, left it on top of my car. Those patterns of words don't really have anything in common, but they all qualify as phrases because they are just groups of words. Not a whole lot of rules for what qualifies as a phrase. However, there are some pretty strict rules for what qualifies as a clause. Clause is the one thing you'll need to know. People often refer to clauses and sentences as synonymous, but at the college level, that doesn't really work. A clause is basically a simple sentence. It has a subject and a predicate. But sometimes it also has a subordinating conjunction, so it can't always function as a sentence. I try to explain it like this. Basically, if you don't want to memorize the subordinating conjunctions, and who does, think of it as a word at the front that weakens the clause so much that you can't understand the sentence on its own. Imagine if somebody walked up to you and said, "Because I was fired from that job." And that's all they said. You would understand "I was fired from that job," but you would not know why they added the word "because." That's a kind of signal word that says we need more words for this sentence to be a complete sentence. So even though it's a clause, because it has a subject, I, and a verb, was fired, it can't stand by itself. The second example there, Jordan hates mushrooms. That one's simple. You can understand it if somebody walked up to you and said that. You might wonder why they were telling you that, but you would understand the words. All right, so you need to know independent and dependent clauses. Super simple, exactly what I just explained. An independent clause can be a full simple sentence on its own. Example, the figures were seen near Area 51. A dependent clause has a subordinating conjunction, or basically just a word that makes it weak so that it can't be on its own as a sentence. So, for example, because the figures were seen near Area 51, or after the figures were seen near Area 51, or if the figures were seen near Area 51. That doesn't make any sense because you've got that word that signals to your brain that you're going to need more info to understand that sentence. So now that we know what phrases and clauses are, go back, make sure you know it. I'm going to explain the 3 most common mistakes in sentences and tell you how to fix them. They're very simple once you know all the vocab. It's just you have to actually know what a subject and a predicate are to be able to identify them, and in my experience, that becomes complicated at the college level. All right, so the first one is a sentence fragment. You've probably seen me write this on your proposal or some correction that I've done for you. Most of the time when college students use fragments, it's like this third example right here, where it's basically just a list. It's just really common for someone to include a list for emphasis and then just not add a predicate. And that's, fine. And a lot of like creative writing does that, but for formal writing you can't actually do it. All right, so basically fragment is just a subject or just a predicate, or sometimes it's just a phrase. So you see my phrases again: that red teapot, rolling away, broken, discarded, unusable, left it on top of my car. Sometimes a fragment is a complete sentence with a subordinating conjunction or a relative pronoun at the beginning. So like, when I get my degree, what the doctor said, however you like to order your pizza, etc. So depending on what type of fragment it is, there are different ways to fix it. They're very easy. Fixing fragments. If it's just a phrase, add a subject or a predicate. If it's just a subject, add a predicate. If it's just a predicate, add a subject. Very simple. If it's a dependent clause, it's also pretty simple. Usually, I find that students just fix these by adding them to the sentence before or after with appropriate punctuation, which we'll talk about. But you can also fix it by completely rewriting the sentence if you want to. I do want to take this second to point out that when you add a dependent clause to an independent clause to put them together to make them a full sentence, there's a little trick to the punctuation. If you see where I'm circling, if you put the subordinating conjunction or the relative pronoun or whatever weakens the dependent clause first, you need to have a comma after it, but if you put it afterward, you don't. You know this from your own experience with language, but you may not know that that's the reason. So basically, you can remember it by looking at this. You don't need punctuation if the independent clause is first, and then, so we've got a dependent clause that begins with the word if, and we've got another dependent clause with the word if the dependent clause comes first, comma, you do. See? You can remember it by looking at that. That's not a very strict rule. I'm not going to be complaining much about it, but I did want you to know. All right, so the next and probably the most major mistake that college students is the comma splice. Comma splices are by far the most common. So basically, they occur when two independent clauses, meaning two clauses with their own subject and predicate, are only joined by a comma. This is a really common way that informal writing happens. I write informally like this. It's really no big deal. You just have to make sure that when you're doing academic writing, you don't make this mistake. So if we've got two independent clauses here, the teapot is broken and I have to buy a new one, we've joined them with just a comma, and that is incorrect. That comma is not strong enough to put those two sentences together like that. Think of it as if you're building a bridge. Do you want steel to join your bridge, or do you want a toothpick to join your bridge? So here we've got a toothpick and we need steel. So here's how to fix it. Most of the time you just fix it by adding a conjunction and a comma. Sometimes you can fix it by adding a subordinating conjunction and connecting it to another sentence. Most commonly you'll say the teapot is broken, comma, so I have to buy a new one. By doing this, you've added steel. You can also try making one a dependent clause. Because the teapot is broken, I have to buy a new one. Or I have to buy a new teapot because mine is broken. And note that again, that no comma is required when the subordinating conjunction is after. Or, and I always offer this because the best way to avoid a mistake is to just not do anything that confuses you. You can always just revise the sentence entirely so that you're not in a position where you're worried about whether or not it's a comma splice. So I have to buy a replacement for my broken teapot, or my broken teapot needs to be replaced. That's a little bit passive, so it's not a great sentence, but it's backed you out of the corner of worrying about whether or not you have a comma splice. So it's always, always, always an option to just revise entirely. So you can add a conjunction and a comma. You can make it a dependent clause and connect it to another sentence, or you can just rewrite the whole sentence so that the issue of the comma is no longer an issue. All right, so the final mistake is the fused sentence. This one is common when students are not confident about where their subjects are. So I've given a simplistic example. Obviously, your sentences will be more advanced than this, but I've just given a simple version so I can show you that a fused sentence is when two or more independent clauses are joined with no punctuation, or often with just a conjunction. So here we've got Noah's favorite toy is a blue train, Aiden's is a red Mickey Mouse. you see that Noah's favorite toy is a blue train would certainly be its own sentence, and so would Aiden's is a red Mickey Mouse. We've got nothing joining it here. Usually people don't actually do this one where they just write two full sentences in a row with nothing. Usually it's the second version that's still incorrect, where they just put the word but in between. But or and or whatever. Again, if we're joining our bridge, this is not the correct joiner. We would need a comma and a conjunction, or we would need some other form of joining these together. But you have to be able to identify them to fix them, so make sure that you are looking at where your subjects are in your sentence. Right, so when you need to fix a fused sentence, you can do basically the same thing as with a comma splice. You can add a comma and a conjunction. You can separate it into two sentences, or you can revise entirely. Noah and Aiden's favorite toys are a blue train and a red Mickey Mouse. So there we've got a compound subject and a compound predicate, but really only one clause. So we've gotten ourselves out of the problem of having two clauses joined together. So those are the three major sentence mistakes and some strategies for fixing them. Go back over this, or just open the slides so you don't have to listen to the whole video again, and make sure that you really understand what they are and how to fix them. In the next video, I'm just going to be going over a couple more grammar things and then showing you what you need to do in your assignment. All right.